Hello, my name is Nicole and this is Know It's Crochet. Today we're going to be doing a Fiber 101 class. This is going to be kind of a high level overview of all of the different things that go into our favorite part of the craft, crocheting yarn, right? So yarn comes in so many different makeups and weights and constructions and contents that it's just kind of mind-blowing, and especially when we are a newbie to crocheting. I know when I started crocheting, oh gosh, it was about 3 years ago now. Is it really only that long? It seems like it's been a lot longer than that, but I do a lot of crocheting. But anyway, I digress. One of the things that I was fascinated by and equally overwhelmed by is the amount of yarn options out there. It's just like, okay, so it's not just confined to my grandma's acrylic that is super itchy, or the higher end version of grandma's acrylic, which is the wool, which is also still super itchy. There are a ton of options out there, and I thought I'd share a little bit about what I've learned in the short amount of time that I've been crocheting, because I kind of nerd out on that stuff. I love to dive deep into the details. So let me bring some of those details to you. What involves four different sort of subcategories, and these are the contents that make up the yarn that we use. The first category is plant-based fibers. This might be something like bamboo or cotton or linen. Those are maybe the most common, and then sometimes you also see hemp as well, and there are some others out there, but those are the majority of like the plant-based fibers, things that come from plants that tend to be more naturally based. The next category are those animal fibers. And while these are still naturally based, these come from animals, like sheep makes wool. We also have cashmere, we have alpaca, we have Angora, we have, so many different types of animal fibers out there. And if you're not familiar, Kiviot is one of the most expensive animal fibers or yarns, really, that you can find. If you've never looked up Kiviot, I challenge you to go look that up, but make sure you stay seated when you see how expensive that is. You thought your $40 a skein yard at the local yarn shop was expensive? It doesn't have anything on Kiviot. Anyway, we digress because I do that. The next kind of category are the synthetics. And synthetics, as you might kind of have guessed, those are your things like your acrylics, your nylons, your polyester, things that are man-made. So they're made by man in order for us to be able to work with them. Acrylic is probably the most common yarn type, especially for us crocheters, because it is really inexpensive. However, if you've been watching a lot of my crochet reviews, you know that there are other yarns that are a really affordable price as well that don't fall into that acrylic category. It's all about doing a little bit of shopping and research. Now, each of the different types of yarn are going to have different properties. So it's important to really look at and do a deeper dive. If you're interested in cotton, knowing what it is about cotton that is going to be beneficial. It is a natural product. It is somewhat sustainably sourced. I'm not going to get too much into the environmental sustainability because I don't track that well enough to be an authority on it. So I don't want to I don't want to say the wrong thing on any of these kind of factors. So as far as environmentally friendly, I'm just going to kind of bow out of that category and leave that one a little bit to the experts. But cotton yarn, it definitely has the ability to feel cooler. It doesn't retain the heat like a wool or a synthetic would, which can be very beneficial for summer garments. It's also great for household goods because you can wash it quite a bit. Now there's different categories of cotton yarn. There are kitchen cottons, which are going to be a lot more coarse, and then there are much more soft cottons that are great for garments. So even within each category, you're going to have different variables. And when you kind of start going down the rabbit hole, you can see that this gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? For sure. So that's kind of the first category, is what your yarn is made up of. The next category is the weight. Oosh. Okay. So this one is a super confusing category because weight isn't truly weight. The weight of your yarn does not necessarily relate to how heavy the yarn is. It's a better term for this is actually gauge, because if you think about gauge in things like piercings or wire gauge or things like that, then those are all fairly universal in that it's the diameter around for that particular item. And that seems to be what they're trying to get to with this, but it's not quite going over that well. So size is really kind of what we're going to kind of call that. Even though weight is the industry term, it's actually the size of the yarn. Now, the Craft Yarn Council has set up certain word categories that relate to these things. And it starts all the way kind of at the bottom with our lace weight yarns. The lace weight yarns are category 0, size 0, weight 0. Yes, all of that. And it goes up from there. Fingering weight is going to be a 1. Sport weight would be a 2. DK weight is a 3. Worsted weight, which we're all probably very familiar with, is 4. So on, all the way up to a 7 is like super bulky or super chunky, depending on the terminology you use. So the Craft Yarn Council has sort of created these verbiages that we can kind of use and say, okay, well, if this is a category 4 weight yarn and the pattern calls for category 4 weight yarn, I should be able to use that yarn. Yeah, not so much. Unfortunately, the category or the weight or the size of the yarn is so variable that it is not a great resource for making sure that that weight yarn is going to work in the project that you are going to be making, especially if size matters. So things like garments, just because it's a 4 weight yarn does not mean it's going to crochet up like the 4 weight yarn that the designer used in her pattern. So it's definitely something that we can use as a starting point, but then we have to do more research and look deeper. And one of the ways that we can do this is by investing in one of these little guys, which is, I'm going to pull it back here and then zoom in, because when I do that, my camera doesn't autofocus. This is a wraps per inch measurement tool. And they've given us, you can wrap your yarn around like this and then count how many times. So if you wrap it, you're basically kind of just stacking it right next to each other and then counting how many times it wraps around. However, they've given us a little cheater and broken it down to a little kind of divot there. So all we have to do is take our yarn, and I picked a bad color for this, and stretch it across to see which one it better matches overall. So that's a really handy tool. But there's more. I also like to use a category, and I'll link to this down below, where we take the yardage and divide it by, and I'm going to probably say this wrong because I'm terrible at math. And so saying one divided by the other versus the other divided by one, I don't know which one's which. But anyway, we have to figure out how many yards per ounce that is in that yarn. Yes. Once we know that, and then we can kind of compare it to what the ounces per yards per ounce that the designer used in her pattern, we will have a much better kind of idea. That's going to give us a closer approximation to start from. So if we're within a certain kind of, here, let me put it over here. I'm going to put a graphic up here for you that kind of breaks it down. And if you're within a certain range for your ounces per yard per ounces, yeah, oof, hopefully you're getting what I'm trying to say here, then you're more likely to get gauge using the hook sizes that they're recommending. And then, of course, you really, truly, especially if you're doing garments, want to check that gauge. Do a gauge swatch to see how many stitches per inch you're getting. Because if you're way off, your garment size is going to be way off, either too small or too big. Trust me, I've been there. You do not want that headache and that frustration of getting all the way done and then realizing these hours and hours and hours that you've put into this top and you cannot wear it. Yep, ask me how I know. The next category we have is the look. And that is what we call the coloring. There are so many different ways to color yarn. Everything from the hand-dyed, which just because we call it hand-dyed doesn't mean that that's not describing the color. That's just describing the process of how it was colored. We're talking variegated and tonal and solid colors and color phasing. All of those kind of good things go into when we're talking about what a yarn looks like. So the first category we have on the coloring is whether it's a solid or what's called a semi-solid. Usually a solid is going to be something that is mass produced and it's going to have a color all through that is very consistent. There is no change whatsoever. They make this huge vat of color, dip all the yarn in, the yarn stays for a certain period of time, and they pull it out. That's going to give you a solid color. Now, if you're getting a hand-dyed yarn that is considered a solid, there is a good chance that there's going to be some variation in it. I'm not sure if you can see, yeah, I think you can a little bit, how it's a little bit darker in here versus like up here, it's a little bit lighter. This is a hand-dyed skein. So it's going to have a lot more variation in the color, even though it is considered a solid color yarn. The next category that we have is variegated. Yes. The next category we have is variegated versus self-striping. So variegated is going to be where there's different colors throughout the skein. It doesn't necessarily have to be hand-dyed. You can have manufactured variegated yarns as well. This one is hand-dyed with lots of different colors in there. And it's just sort of random where those colors get placed. The other option is a self-striping yarn that's very common when you get like a sock yarn, where the repeat is very consistent. A good example of self-striping yarn is like the Red Heart Granny Square yarns, where it is a predictable place where you're going to have a color change. That's a self-striping yarn of a different type in that you can make a granny square with it versus it's just going in even stripes. So that's another way to look at the different colors. We also have different options that are sort of, you kind of don't fall into any of those other ones. The first is like a tonal colorway where they're all shades of the same color, but in different saturations. That's what I'm looking for. So this is all purple, but you can see there's some lighter purple and some darker purples in there. So this is a tonal yarn, meaning that there's different tones of the same color. We also have yarns that are like tweed, and tweed is a whole different sort of ball game where they weave in little nubs. They're actually called nibs. Nibs, I think they're called, where you get little kind of almost flecks. And of course, we do not want to forget that there are different dye lots. Now, I've been fortunate, knock on all kinds of different wood, that I've never run into an issue where if my yarn ran out and I needed a different color or more of it, that the dye lot didn't match enough that it was noticeable. But that can absolutely happen, especially if you're doing a larger project. Yarn dyers try to be very consistent with the yarn that they're dyeing and the colors, but there are always changes. It could be a temperature change. It could be that there is a slight variation in how the yarn takes the color today. So many variables come into dyeing that it is very feasible that when yarn is dyed at different times, which is what the dye lot indicates when it was dyed, if it was dyed in the same batch, then you could get a slight difference. And sometimes it matters. It definitely can matter. So you might be having a very large project and all of a sudden you switch dye lots, and now that beautiful white turns into a slight kind of cream. And it's very definitely noticeable. Again, I've been fortunate that I've not run into that myself, but I certainly have seen a lot of projects out there where that happens. So just make sure that you're buying enough of the same dye lot to complete your entire project. Now we're going to get into another category that can be incredibly expansive, and that is construction, how the yarn is made. So the construction of your yarn is going to vary greatly, and the most common term that you'll hear is plied yarn. And yarn comes plied in either a 1-strand, 2-strand, 3-strand, well, 1, 2, 4, or 8 typically. This yarn, which is a very common kitchen yarn, kitchen cotton, comes as a 4-ply, and you can see I've separated out the plies here. Hopefully you can kind of see them. I will zoom in for sure. You can see each of those little 4 strands. So that is a 4-ply yarn. 4-ply is probably the most common, especially in like a worsted weight yarn. So that's one of those kind of categories to keep in mind. But we also have something called chainette, and this is the Lion Brand 24/7, which is a very popular chainette yarn. So rather than coming with plies that are just twisted together, this is actually worked into a chain, and that chain is actually what you're crocheting with. But the chainette is another kind of construction. We also have unplied yarn, or what's also sometimes called a roving yarn. And this is a different kind of yarn in that there is no twist whatsoever to this yarn. It's not plied. They don't take different strands and spin them together. Instead, what they do is they take the base yarn, which is called roving, which is really big, kind of fluffy, chunky base type of product, and they pull it into a very thin strand, and that's what you get as your roving or your unplied yarn. Now, unplied yarn is very soft, but it splits very easily. It tends to pill quite easily, and can be very challenging to frog. So if you're looking for something that's super soft but a challenging yarn, then definitely a roving or an unplied yarn is something that you do find this. This was at Michael's. The Michael's Facets or Loops and Threads Facets is a very common yarn, and I see so many people pick it up because it's beautiful and it's soft, but it is definitely tricky to work with. The other thing you definitely want to take into consideration when shopping for your fiber is the care instructions. It's often one of the first things that I look at. Well, probably the third thing. First is how it feels, second is how expensive is it, and third is how hard is it to keep up. Because the care instructions on different yarns, even across the same fiber content, can vary greatly. So there might be some cottons that are completely fine to wash and others that say hand wash only. So if care of your garments is something that you really want to be conscious of, then make sure that you're checking the label. There are everything from the machine wash, machine dry, acrylics that are going to be totally fine under most circumstances to the dry clean only silks and cashmeres that it's like, do I really want to have something that I have to take to a dry cleaner? Most yarns are going to fall within the machine wash, lay flat to dry, to the hand wash, lay flat to dry. That's where most yarns are going to fall. If you need something that's less sensitive than that, just make sure you're checking the yarn labels first. So that's it for our High Level Fiber 101 course, and I would love to know from you if you want me to do a deep dive on any of these categories. Let me know what category you want me to start with first in the comments below. I'm working on a couple of them, but I definitely want to know that this is a topic you want to hear more about because they take me a little bit more effort to kind of work them up. Thank you so much. And hey, Farah, frog us out of here.